Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. I've had a few viewers complain about how slowly I talk, how long it takes me to get to things like sound quality, and so I thought I'd mix things up and share with you a super quick review today. Here we go. Now, of course, I'm actually joking. What's going on here is this is the second time I've recorded this review, and the reason is that there was a catastrophic failure with my audio recording the first time around. What you just heard was the result of that. I sped up the footage to match. But the point is, I'm having a second crack at this one now, so hopefully it's going to be extra good because I've already had a rehearsal.
아침에 눈을 뜨자마자 느낀 설레임 blossomin' 향기로운 달콤한 햇볕에 노인거리는 꽃 같아 다 보고 싶지 않는데 말하고 싶지 않아
What I'm reviewing here today is the Sendy Apollo and also the HiFiMan Edition XS. I've chosen to put these into a single review for a few reasons. One of them is they're both retailing at $499 US. They both were released at about the same time, and they're both planar magnetic headphones. As you'll hear soon, there are a lot of differences once you get past those initial basics, but I still think they're worthy of considering at the same time. When I announced the Sendy Apollo on the channel in the community page, a number of you had some very specific questions. Things like how does it compare to the Sundara, how does it compare to the Ananda, and how does it compare to the Verum 1? And so I'm going to answer all of those questions here. I'm going to compare the Apollo with the XS, but I'm going to scatter in those other headphones just to paint a full picture for you. Before I get into the details of the review, I want to send a huge thanks to channel patron Dar. He's been kind enough to order a pair of XS for himself and have them sent straight to me. So he's never opened these, looked at these, or listened to them, and here I am reviewing them. So it's very generous on his behalf. I certainly appreciate it, and I'm sure you viewers do as well. So thank you, Dar, for making this review of the HiFiMan Edition X possible. I should also thank Sendy Audio for sending me out a set of the Apollos and also the gorgeous wooden headphone stand that they're standing on. To be really clear, the Apollos don't come with this stand. I believe it's going to be an extra additional purchase for those that want it, but it's quite a unique looking stand. Some are going to think that it looks like a broken limb that's been poorly set. That's going to be up to you, but for me, I think it's quite unique, and I actually like the fact that this elbow here becomes the resting place for the headphones themselves. So I'm not here to review the stand, but I did want to call it out and make it clear that it doesn't come with the headphone. It is an additional option you can get with the Sendy headphones. Now, of course, most of you are going to be really keen to find out how they sound, but before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the design, specifications, comfort, etc. of each headphone. And I'll start with the XS because it's closer to me. If this headphone looks a bit like a mashup, I think it's because it is. What they've done with the Edition XS is take the headband from something like an HE400 SE, and they've meshed it with the cups of something like an Ananda. In fact, to look at the cups, it looks exactly like the Ananda. Same color scheme, same shape. I'm pretty sure it's the same pads. Everything's pretty similar. So you've got the top half of a cheaper headphone, the bottom half of a more expensive headphone, and whilst individually I really like the headband of the 400 series and I quite like the oval shaped cups of the Ananda, together something's not quite right. It's not dreadful, but I find this combination quite unstable on the head. When I'm wearing these and I move my head at all, it feels to me like the headphone could easily slip out of place or fall off my head altogether. That's never happened, so it's probably just a feeling rather than a reality, but it does put me off slightly and it makes me aware that I'm wearing a headphone. So I'm not a huge fan of the combination of these, even though I like them independently. When I was switching between the XS and the Sundara and the Ananda as part of my comparisons for this review, the change in comfort was really evident. Both the Ananda and the Sundara use a suspension style headband, which I found much more stable than the HE400 style headband, and so that would have been my preference. I'm guessing it costs more and they were looking to keep costs down here, I'm not sure. As I said though, it's absolutely not a deal breaker. The headphone never fell off my head and it is still generally comfortable. It's just not quite as stable as I'd like it to feel. Also keep in mind, I have no hair. Maybe having hair makes a difference. It might be a very different experience for you. While we're talking about headphone design, a couple of final things to point out is that you've got the normal 3.5mm entries on the bottom of the headphones. That's become really standard for HiFiMan now. And then the pads themselves, as I've already mentioned, I'm pretty sure are identical to the Ananda pads in that they use a synthetic leather on the outer edges, maybe it's genuine leather, and then they use a fabric pad on the facing surface that touches the skin. It's a very comfortable setup and I like it across the board on all of HiFiMan's headphones. Finally, I should also mention, in case you're not familiar with HiFiMan headphones, that you always get a little bit of rotation in the cups, as well as some tilting, and then of course you can adjust the headband to a fairly reasonable size. So all in all, other than that stability issue, they're a fairly well-made headphone that's about right for $499 when coming from HiFiMan. And what I mean by that is HiFiMan's generally aren't the best build quality on the market, but with all the models of theirs I own, which is most of their range, I do find that none of them have ever skipped a beat. So I think they're pretty solid and sturdy, even if they don't feel like the very best made headphones around. Putting these down for a moment, I want to talk about the fact that the Edition XS finally comes with a very nice cable from HiFiMan. It's not exceptional, it's not the sort of cable where you'd never think about an aftermarket one, but finally it's a cable that's usable both from an ergonomic point of view and also a sound quality point of view. It's a fairly thick, rubberized cable, but it's got a nice Y split where the cables diverge up to each ear cup. The strain reliefs and the connectors at each end are good and solid. They're utilitarian rather than designer or flashy, but they're absolutely fine, and it's a cable that I'd be very happy to use for an extended period. So bravo to HiFiMan for finally upping their cable game. Personally, I would still choose to add something like a Heart Audio cable, maybe an Apos Flow, or something even more exotic if you felt to, but it's a good start that you can absolutely use the stock cable without any concerns of it tangling, being uncomfortable, etc. The final thing I'd like to mention before we move on and talk about the Apollo is the specifications and the driver within the XS. The XS is using HiFiMan's stealth magnet design, very similar to the HE400 SE. It's what's trickled down from the Sundara with stops along the way in the new Aria, so it's starting to become a staple and a mainstay in the HiFiMan range, and it seems to produce very good results. I don't want to give too much of the game away yet, and the XS isn't perfect, but it's certainly resulting in some very nice sound. What it may or may not also be doing though is making headphones that aren't particularly easy to drive. The XS are only an 18 ohm headphone, which puts them somewhere in kind of the middle of the range of planar magnetics, probably towards the lower end a little bit if you were to average everything out. But more importantly than that, they've got a sensitivity rating of just 92 decibels. And that makes them a little bit more difficult to drive than some of the other current HiFiMan models. They're not really difficult like say the Sundara, but they're also not quite as easy as something like a Sundara, an Aria or an Ananda. What that means is that you can comfortably drive the XS from any desktop device you're likely to come across, but they're not necessarily going to be a great match with dongles and other portable devices. So do keep that in mind. These are much more of a desktop headphone rather than a portable headphone, but they're also a fairly large open back planar, so I'm not expecting many of you to be looking at them for portable use. Having covered all that off though, let's now take a look at the competitor in the Sendy Audio Apollo. As you can immediately see, the Apollos are a very different design. First and foremost is the fact that they're using genuine wooden cups. And this is kind of a calling card of Sendy Audio and their other company Sivga. Now as I understand it, Sivga is kind of like the Toyota to the Sendy Audio's Lexus. But they all come out of the same factory and you can definitely see similarities. One positive of that is they're very good at making beautiful looking wooden cup headphones. And the Apollos are no exception. You've got these lovely wooden cups here, and then on the front of them you've got this intricate design using 2 layers of metal to produce a sunburst style effect over the grille. And I personally think it looks quite good. Obviously that's up to your preferences, but I do like it. And then those of you familiar with Sivga and Sendy are likely to recognize the headband setup. This is a very common setup that's also been used on headphones like the Sivga P2 and also the Phoenix. And that's not a bad thing at all. I think it's quite a nice headband. It gives you some nice in and out motions there of the headphones, you get some tilt from the yoke, and then you get a suspension band here which slides up and down on 2 rails. So it's a good enough system. It's not my favourite system around, but it's pretty solid and very, very comfortable. Something else that adds to the comfort are the pads on these. So what the Apollos feature is a very, very soft, very plush feeling leather and memory foam type pad that's extremely squishy and padded, and it's also got quite a broad face where it touches against the head. Now that's good and bad. First, it means it distributes the force very evenly and it's very, very comfortable from a pressure point of view, but it does also mean that if you're in a hot climate, and particularly a humid climate, you may find these get a bit hot and sticky in summer. We've had some hot weather here in Australia recently, and I did find these just a little bit clammy on those hotter days. Thanks to the fabric face on the XS pads, I never had any such problems with the HiFiMans, so it is something to be aware of with the Apollos. Another thing worth mentioning about the pads is that it felt to me like the pads aren't quite as deep as maybe they could be. I didn't feel like I actually touched the surface of the driver or the covering of the driver in the Apollos, but I felt like it was really close. And that could be because of the super plush foam allowing a bit more compression compared to the XS, which is a little bit firmer. And even though the XS pads look to me to be about the same depth, maybe even slightly shallower than the Apollo, I never felt like I was going to touch the XS internals, but I did feel like I might on the Apollo. So if you happen to have larger ears and or ears that are more outward turning, then you may have issues with the Apollo. I certainly had no issues myself, so it's probably something to check on forums and other reviews to see what you hear, but it is something I think you should be aware of. The final thing to mention about the headphone design itself is that we've got 2 front-facing 2.5mm sockets. Now I've got no personal issue with 2.5mm connections. I know some people aren't a fan. I've got no issues at all, and I like the fact that these are forward-facing. It means that when you do put a headphone on a stand, and it's not such an issue on this one because it's quite a tall stand, but if you have a lower headphone stand, it prevents the headphone cable from coming out and immediately creating pressure as it has to turn at a sharp angle onto the desk. So I like that design feature on the Apollos and any other headphones using it. That said, it's not a big deal. I've never had problems with the HiFiMans either because I tend to choose headphone stands with a bit of height to them. Finally, while talking about cables, the Apollo also comes with a nice braided copper cable terminated in a 4.4mm connector, which is fantastic if you want to run them balanced, and they do also come with an adapter to take that 4.4mm down to a 3.5, which you can then adapt back up to a 6.3 if you need it. So I like the versatility that the Apollos give, and I do think it's a nice offering for any current modern headphone. The final accessory is this black leather carry case or fake leather, which honestly, I'm neither here nor there on. These are not a headphone I would expect to carry around. I never think about carrying around open back headphones like that. It's a relatively compact, hard case, and it's a nice addition for those that might want to travel with their headphones. And so with all that out of the way, let's get into what you're no doubt really here for, which is the sound quality. And I've done this review a little bit differently. Normally I'll talk about the overall sound quality of each headphone separately, and then do a comparison track to bring it all together. But on this occasion, what I'm going to do is step through 4 different comparison tracks and share with you what I hear on each, and gradually build a picture of these 2 headphones for you. As I said at the beginning, I'm also going to scatter in comparisons of the Sundara, the Ananda, and the Verum 1. A couple of other things I should mention is that before testing, I did run these through at least 100 hours of burn-in music, and what you'll see on the frequency response graph is that the Edition XS didn't change at all, but interestingly, the Apollo did. The reason I did the burn-in is because Sendy recommend the burn-in, and you can definitely see a change in the treble response as a result of that. Now, I didn't mind them out of the box, I thought they sounded fine, but they're definitely a smoother listen after the burn-in, for better or worse, as we'll talk about. And now one final thing before we get on with the comparison tracks is to let you know that the tracks you're going to hear me talk about today are all in my curated playlists. What I mean by that is that patrons of the channel get access to a set of playlists that I've personally curated and selected the individual tracks, and I've also provided some listening notes alongside each playlist so that patrons can try the same tracks that I try with my headphones, and DACs and amplifiers as well. So if you're interested in seeing the full curated playlists, and you can also see them as they evolve because I'm constantly adding new tracks, then jump over to Patreon, there's a link down in the description, and see if you'd like to join the Passion for Sound family. It'll give you access to my curated test tracks, as well as a bunch of other stuff. It's all listed on Patreon. So go check it out if you're interested. If not, that's totally fine. Let's kick on with the review. The first track I tried is called Tears Run Dry by Malia and Boris Blank, and it's a great recording overall, but I was specifically interested in it for its bass characteristics. I wanted to hear how the XS and the Apollo handled bass. Listening to Tears Run Dry on the Apollo, it was a very enjoyable listen. Most noticeable was that the vocals from Malia are very focused and present. It's a very enjoyable mid-range forward type headphone. I did find that the bass was probably a little bit light, particularly how well I know this track, but it wasn't completely lacking. The headphone didn't feel lightweight and weightless or soulless, but I do feel like it could have done with just a bit more punch and a bit more drive. Overall though, what this track showed me listening to the Apollos was that they're a very clean and articulate sound. The mid-range has a nice sense of texture and clarity. It's forward and it's got a bit of richness, but it's not thick or muddy in any way. Jumping over to the XS and turning up the volume a bit because they are a bit harder to drive, what I immediately heard was bass that was more present and more deeply extended. It still didn't have a great deal of punch to it, because that sort of punch is generally going to come from the tuning of the headphone having a bit of a bump in the mid bass, which neither of these headphones do. The XS is more of a very flat frequency response, which means the extension is excellent, the presence across all bass registers is excellent, but it doesn't give an enhanced sense of thump or rhythm. That could be good, that could be bad, it depends on your tastes. It's important to note though, while I'm talking about bass, that the XS, despite having more extension and therefore more presence in the bass, is not a bassy headphone as such. There's a lot of mid-range and a lot of treble information included, and it's actually overall quite a neutral sounding headphone. In fact, at its price, I think it's one of the best balanced headphones I've tried in terms of having the bass, the mid-range and the treble all balanced with one another. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right headphone for everybody, because different people will find different sound signatures enjoyable, and that's partly why I'm going to run through the comparisons that I am. But so far, the XS and the Apollo have both impressed me, the XS in particular with its sense of openness and clarity across the board, from bass all the way through to treble. Speaking of openness, I should mention that the XS does throw a slightly larger soundstage that's mostly left and right, not a lot of depth, whereas the Apollo, because of its slight richness in the mid-range, does tend to bring everything a bit closer, more into focus on the mids, and therefore the soundstage is a bit more conical rather than left, right, wide. Once again, neither is better or worse, it's going to depend on your preferences. Overall, I'd say the XS is a more balanced overall sound, whereas the Apollo is a little bit more romantic or euphonic. And what I mean when I say euphonic, euphony refers to enjoyment by the ears. And so when I'm saying euphonic, it's a sound that is just enjoyable to listen to. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong or anything like that, it's just generally pleasing to the ears. And so with an emerging picture now of the Apollo and the XS, I decided to grab the Sundara. The Sundara sits a little bit below these in terms of price, but it's definitely going to be a headphone that people consider alongside these two. And what I heard when I listened to the Sundaras was that it's very much a midpoint between the two. It's a little bit richer sounding than the XS, but it's not as rich sounding as the Apollo. That said, I found it a little bit more grainy than either of these two headphones. So with the richer sounding Apollo, it kind of makes sense that it sounded smoother, but the Apollo comes across a bit more refined in the treble as well. Likewise, the XS, despite being a brighter, more neutral sounding headphone, it was also more refined in the treble, and I'm thinking that just shows the technology of the stealth magnet design in the XS and allowing a better waveform, a less distorted waveform to come from the planar magnetic driver, past the magnets and to your ears. That's just a theory, but the end result is a smoother, more refined treble, despite there being a bit more of it from the XS. And so for me at this point, unless you're battling the dollars, there's no reason to choose the Sundara over either of these. The Sundara is still a great headphone, particularly given that it's often significantly cheaper than these two, but if you've got the budget for either of these two, I would still consider both of them. And so with that said, let's move to the second test track. And this time it's The Morning After by Ronnie Jordan, which is a very lightly instrumented guitar solo on an acoustic guitar. It's a very gentle track with lots of space in the recording and some really interesting instruments for tonal accuracy. I started off with the XS this time around, and it rendered this track really nicely. Things like the opening percussion, I think they're called timbres, I'm not sure. Let me know down in the comments if you happen to listen to this track and know what the name of those drums is. But I'm referring to those drums that are played with the hand, and they have a sort of an upper mid-range sort of sound to them. They sounded great from the XS. Likewise, everything else did too, but if I had to nitpick, I'd say that things like the plucking of the guitar strings and sliding of the finger along the fretboards had just a little bit too much emphasis from from the XS. It drew my attention too much to it rather than letting me take in the overall sonic picture. Some people are going to love that level of detail and clarity. It's certainly not harsh or bad or anything like that, but I did find it reduced my sense of naturality from the XS just a little bit. I felt like the XS was providing me with a good sense of space and imaging, but it's not exceptional. And something that you'll hear me talk a bit about the XS is that it produces a nice wide soundstage, but the image is not particularly well focused. It's not bad, but it's not excellent, as I'll talk about shortly with another comparison. Finally, with the XS, the other thing I noticed on this track was that the bass was present, but it's not enhanced. And on a track like this, that's really important. This is, as I said before, a fairly light, gentle track, and so you don't want some big, thick, heavy bass line coming through and being overblown and taking away the lightness of the instrumentation. So the XS managed that really well thanks to its very linear bass response. All in all, it was a good listen from the XS. Jumping over to the Apollo, and the results are probably what you're expecting, which is to say the guitar was brought forward in the mix and given this lovely sense of harmonic richness by the Apollos. For me, it made the guitar sound better than the XS did. It also focused the image a little bit better than the XS did, but it did come at a cost. And that is that all of the rest of the instruments were kind of a bit pushed to the back and a little bit muffled. Not in the sense that they were really thick and lost, but they certainly weren't as available and clear as from the XS. What I found from the Apollo was that it really pulled my attention in on the guitarist, and it brought it all closer to me and sort of helped me connect more with the music. But that's not necessarily a good thing across the board, it just worked really well on this particular track. So I do like what the Apollo can do, I do like the romanticism that they bring to the music, but it's not always going to work as well as it does on this track, as we'll hear shortly, and it doesn't for me necessarily make them better than the XS, they're just quite different presentations. Now before I moved on, I grabbed the HiFiMan Ananda to also check on this track, and what I heard was that the Ananda is much closer in sound to the XS than say something like the Sundara, which kind of split the difference between the two of these. The Ananda's extension isn't quite as deep and flat as the XS, and instead what it's got is a little bit of a bass hump in the mid-bass. The result is a slightly punchier sounding headphone, which is very enjoyable for that, but it does make it a little bit different from what you hear from the XS. The XS is overall more neutral and flat, whereas the Ananda brings a bit of colour and a bit of flavour to the music. Not as much as the Apollo, but definitely more than the XS. To me, the Ananda makes the music all sound a bit more natural overall. It got the tonality of that acoustic guitar more like the Apollo, so there's a bit more of the harmonic richness and a little bit less of those fine details that are a bit distracting. I also feel like the imaging from the Ananda was a bit stronger than the XS, but it also may have been a little bit more intimate and a little bit less space left and right. So it's all going to be trade-offs, and ultimately what I found at the end of that comparison was that if I had to list all three for their benefits, you'd choose the XS for its pure neutrality, you'd choose the Apollo for its romanticism and its euphony, and you'd choose the Ananda for being a very natural presentation. I don't always find the XS completely natural, even though it is very neutral. Likewise, I don't find the Apollo completely natural because it is going into that more lush, rich mid-range. And so before I put down the Anandas, I jumped to my next track because I wanted to check out just how well the Anandas stacked up, or vice versa, how these stacked up to the Anandas being the more expensive headphone. The next track I tried was 6-inch Stilettos by Naya Azumi, and I happen to know that this is a really nicely recorded track. It's able to produce a fantastic sense of layering in the soundstage, a really holographic central image on the vocal, which is well separated from everything around it. And interestingly, on this particular track, I felt like the XS did a better job than the Ananda. And I think what's going on there is that the Ananda is probably going to be a little bit more forgiving on poor recordings, but what that also means is it doesn't necessarily give you the full insight into an excellent recording like this one. To me, going to the XS after the Ananda on this particular track, everything just sounded really nicely balanced. All the instruments were well placed in the mix, the vocal was just right, there was a good sense of texture, a good sense of richness, a good sense of bass, it was all just spot on. Whereas I felt like the Ananda maybe smoothed things off just a little bit too much on this particular track. Once again, I did feel like the image was a bit of a shortcoming of the XS. It wasn't quite as focused as I know it can be, but the space and the staging were quite good. It's just that the image is a little tiny bit smeared, or it's a tiny little bit out of focus might be a better term. Smeared might sound like it's kind of all over the place, it's definitely not. It's just not as tightly, sharply focused as I'd like. The kick bass in this track from the XS had a good sense of weight and thump to it. It's still not particularly punchy, but it's got the presence that it needs. A tiny bit more might have been nice, but it's certainly very acceptable. At the other end of the scale, the treble from the XS is very clean, very detailed, but it never gets harsh. Everything's just ultimately really nicely balanced. Jumping over to the Apollo then on this track, things weren't so strong. I felt like the Apollo went a bit too far on this track. It smoothed things over too much, and I lost all of what I love about this track in its detail and its clarity and its recording quality. I felt like the Apollo made the vocals from Naoya Izumi just a little bit too boxed in. It actually sounded a bit like he was singing with a blocked nose, and it wasn't dreadful, but it wasn't as good as I know it could sound. The Apollos also somehow managed to make the rest of the instruments in this track sound like they were recorded a long time ago on poorer quality recording equipment. Things just sounded a bit muffled, a bit mellow, and like what I expect from old 50s or 60s recordings. Not that all those recordings were bad, but when you do get a recording from that era that's not particularly well done, it's just got this kind of soft, squishy sound to it that's not as resolving as I think it should be, particularly with a modern recording and the production quality that's gone into it. But I should be really clear here. The sound from the Apollos across the board has been very enjoyable. So I think what we're getting here is one example of a particular track that doesn't gel well with the Apollo. And that's always going to be the risk if you buy a headphone like this that's got a very specific tuning to it. When you buy a headphone that's got certain coloration, there's always the risk that that coloration is going to interact poorly with a particular type of recording. If you had a mixing engineer that mixed it a particular way, maybe they were using a particular set of monitors, or maybe had a particular sound in mind, or a style that they mixed to, then sometimes you can get a coloured headphone that doesn't gel well with that. And I think that's what's going on with the Apollo and 6-inch stilettos, because on almost everything else I listened to, they were incredibly enjoyable. I never once felt like they were doing a bad job of the music until I got to 6-inch stilettos. So do keep that in mind. Don't write the Apollos off because of this one track. They can be a very enjoyable, very relaxing and engaging listen, but you will occasionally hit a speed bump, maybe once every 50, 60 tracks, who knows the numbers, but it's not often. Before I moved on to my final track though, I grabbed the Verum 1s off the wall behind me and gave them a listen, also to 6-inch stilettos. And I was immediately reminded why I love the Verum 1s so much. They just managed everything beautifully on this track. The vocals were wonderfully focused, the tonality was excellent across the board, and jumping between the Verum 1s and the XS, which did a great job on this track, now the XS sounded just a little bit dry, maybe a tiny bit soulless. Which is not to say they sound bad on this track, but I just liked the tiny bit of hint of soul that the Verum 1s brought to the rendition. The XS is definitely the more neutral, flatter sounding headphone in my opinion, but if you're looking for a headphone for music listening, the Verum 1 is still a very strong option. Ultimately for me, if I was looking at a headphone for music enjoyment and I was happy to buy from a small outfit like Verum, then I do think the Verum 1 is probably worth buying over the XS. It's a little bit more comfortable in my opinion. It does have a quirky design that not everyone's going to go for, but I do think for pure musical enjoyment, the Verum 1 just has a slight edge over the XS. However, if you're looking for something that's very neutral, very revealing, and could just as easily be a mixing, mastering, and editing tool as a musical enjoyment tool, then probably that's where the XS does step ahead. So both are excellent headphones, and both definitely have their place, but in choosing between the two, it would come down to me for whether I wanted musical enjoyment with the Verum 1, or whether I wanted more neutrality from the XS. On this particular track, the Apollo lagged a bit behind, but it's not out of the race just yet. And so let's now move on to my final track, to paint the rest of the picture for you. The final track I turned to was Wallflower by Peter Gabriel, and specifically from the New Blood album. This is a fully orchestral recording, and I specifically turned to this to see how each of these would deal with orchestral music, classical music, soundtracks, etc. And so I actually ran through all the different headphones again to see how all of them went on classical music. Starting with the Ananda, it had a wonderful tone for things like the cellos in this track. It really brought out the texture and the richness of the cello, but at the same time I felt like I wanted just a little bit more openness at time from the orchestra, a little bit more of the texture of the strings, a little bit more sense of space in the overall mix. I didn't feel like the Anandas quite nailed it on this particular track. Now having said that, I am aware that this is not the brightest recording of an orchestra, and so that may be playing into it slightly. So take that into account. The Ananda was kind of right on the edge of getting things right, and just erred a little bit towards warmth, but then so does the track. So if you like an overall brighter sound, then you're probably not going to want the Ananda, but if you like a sound that's kind of middle of the road, just a little step towards warmer, then probably the Ananda could be a good choice. Moving to the Sundara, I felt like that also handled the track quite well. It has a different sense of tuning and a few different points of emphasis compared to the Ananda, and in some ways it brought a little bit more of the texture I was looking for compared to what the Ananda did. That doesn't make it better than the Ananda, it just happened to suit this track a bit better. Ultimately though, what I felt by the end of this was that the Sundara is kind of outclassed by most of what we've got here in this comparison in most areas. It does still have its strengths, it's still a very affordable headphone, but I do think there's a couple of others in this comparison that I would comfortably choose over and above it. Moving on to the Verum 1, it produced a very good sound once again. It wasn't quite as textured sounding as say the XS will be when I talk about that in just a moment, but it was very, very good in that regard. It gave me a good sense of texture in the orchestra, a good sense of openness in the sound, and most importantly, it once again showed how well it images by giving me the best sense of all of these, of all the individual sections of the orchestra, not breaking it apart unnaturally, but letting me really hear the expanse of the orchestra laid out in front of me. In contrast to that, the Apollo once again felt just a little bit flat on this track. It wasn't super soft and lacking like in 6-inch stilettos, and it was still a very enjoyable listen as I'll talk about in a second, but tonally it didn't have the brightness and the texture that I would normally look for in an orchestral recording. What it did do, however, was present a wonderfully relaxed and engaging presentation. This is a headphone that I can very easily see people putting on, closing their eyes and just drifting away with the music. So I can't stress enough that even though I'm sometimes referring to this as a headphone that maybe doesn't sound as technically strong as the XS or the Verum 1, I do think its coloration is preferable in certain circumstances. This is a headphone you can put on and enjoy pretty much anything. It's just not a headphone for technical listening. If you want to listen critically to the music, it's probably not the right choice, unless you're wanting to listen critically to specifically mid-range content, in which case for things like trumpets, saxophones, vocals, that's where the Apollo could really excel because it draws your attention into that mid-range and it shows you everything there is to know about the mids, at least at the price point. I'm not saying it's the best headphone on the planet for mid-range, but at its price, it's very strong there. So for those of you that like a big, expansive, textural, airy, orchestral sound, the Apollo definitely isn't the right choice. But for those of you that prefer a more relaxed and smooth presentation of orchestral recordings, the Apollo did sound lovely. And finally, that leads me to the XS, which handled this track beautifully. Because of its very linear response, the XS is brilliant for orchestral recordings because it gives you everything from the deepest, richest notes of say a piano or a cello or a double bass, but it also has the extension and the detail in the treble to give you things like the clarity and the bite of the strings, as well as produce a nice sense of openness and soundstage width. Once again, depth is a bit lacking, and that is an area where I think the Verum 1 steps ahead a little bit again, is its ability to produce a bit more depth and a more focused image. And so for me, I was kind of surprised that at the end of this review, I think the XS and the Verum 1 are the two headphones out of the 5 that I think are the strongest performers here. I do still like the Anandas a lot, but I think I'd probably choose either the Verum 1 or the XS over the Anandas in a lot of cases. The XS brings a little bit of the coloration that the Ananda has, and the XS is a more neutral sounding headphone. So in some ways, if you had an XS and a Verum 1, you've almost got the best of both worlds. But if you had to only choose one of those headphones, I do think the XS is excellent if you want that neutral, more technical delivery. I think the Verum 1 is still a great choice if you want a balance of technicalities and musicality. And then I still think the Apollo is also a lovely choice if you're looking for something that looks and feels great, but also something that's a bit different. It's a bit more relaxed, a bit more engaging in the mid-range, and gives you a coloration that not a lot of other headphones do. And so hopefully by delivering this comparison, I've helped you to work out where to spend your hard-earned money on headphones like this. We're spoiled for choice at the moment with great options like the Verum 1, the XS, the Apollo, and the Ananda. They're all fantastic. Now I'm leaving out the Sundara there because I can't help but think the Sundara's been maybe a little bit surpassed by some of the options in this roundup. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see HiFiMan drop either the Ananda or the Sundara from their line, because I think the XS kind of provides a little bit of what either one does, only doing it better. It's not a direct replacement for either of those, and to be very clear, I have no inside information here, but I'm just speculating that there might be just a few too many models in the HiFiMan lineup, and maybe the XS will ultimately kill one of them off. Which one it is, we'll have to wait and see. For all I know, there might also be revisions coming for the Ananda and the Sundara, which will change the game again. Of course, if that does happen, make sure you're subscribed because I'll be covering them here on the channel. For now though, if you found this review useful, if it has helped clarify your decision-making process, I would love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and hit the like button to tell YouTube that you've enjoyed this video. It helps me understand what content to make for you and what you enjoy seeing. Other than that, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.